It's been an extremely tight schedule, and we're already running a few minutes late for a very full and very rich session. This is the second time in as many conferences that we've had a special study on the social progress within Islamic societies. We felt that it was very important to identify this as an area of special concern, not only because of the events that are occurring throughout the world in terms of political turmoil and economic problems, but because this is a theme that has run through history since at least the 7th century, since the time of the Prophet. The themes and issues and concerns that many people are struggling with are not very different from those that took place during the period of the Great Crusades and the settlement of lands throughout North Africa. The same issues keep coming up repeatedly over and over again. So we felt it was very important for a society committed to the study of quality of life to include this content in a very concentrated way in particular workshops. There will be 4 presentations. The first one will be my dear colleague Habib Tiliouine from Algeria, and he will introduce what his topic will be. The second one will be my new colleague from Korea via Iran, who will be presenting on conceptions of Islamic mental health, broadly speaking. And then I will talk about Islamic social progress along with Habib. And I've given a handout which will carry most of the presentation. I'm just going to summarize basically what's included in the handout because the time will get away from us very quickly. And then Sirgy is going to deal with the issue of terrorism around the world, particularly jihadist terrorism. So we're covering a very, very wide spectrum of topics in the session. So let me begin by introducing Professor Tiliouine.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with all the friends and colleagues of ISQOLS. Now, my presentation will be about life quality worldview. I think this word was added, was modified somehow by Richard, but still it fits very, very well the situation or somebody else, but still life quality worldview, divergence between legalist, Falsafa, and Sufi perspectives. Okay, and this is the map, the historic map of the expansion of Islam since the beginnings in the 7th century and until the 16th century, nearly 1500. And you see that the map or Islam expanded very quickly, and that was unprecedented in the whole human history. In a very short period, it gained all a big region, which is now, we find most of the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the other places, East Asia, and different places that you know. Now, I'm not going to go into history in order to gain some time, but for all Muslims, all those belonging to different schools or different sections, if you want, of Islamic understanding, they all agree that the Quran is the basic source of the Islamic teachings and law and so on. So when the Quran talks about quality of life, I'm taking just 2 verses which lay down the foundations for understanding quality of life roughly. Whoever does right, whether male or female, and is a believer, him verily we shall quicken with good life, and we shall pay them recompense in proportion to the best of what they used to do. That's chapter 16, ayah 1997. And it warns, this is the same Quran, but he who turneth away from remembrance of me, he will have a narrow life, and I shall bring him blind to the assembly on the day of resurrection. So you see, there are two types, if you want, of happiness already that you can distinguish. You've got the happiness on earth, and you've got this happiness leads to to happiness of the hereafter. And they are linked if you are doing well and doing right and following the prescriptions of the teachings of the religion, so you will get a good life after that, and as well you will get a good life here too. So how to reconcile, you know, the necessities of this life and the other life? I think it's not simple, it's not easy. If we think of it, what type of life, how should we, what should we do, and there are a lot of difficulties in combining all the issues that I'm going to expose later on. Okay, so in this presentation, roughly from reading a lot of history books and so on, and a lot of reviews, previous works by people who are interested in this field, at least I could distinguish between three basic orientations. There is a legalist view of quality of life or happiness. We've got a philosopher's perspective, or perspectives, in fact it's in plural, and we've got some Sufi perspectives. Now, the legalist view, what do I mean by legalist view? This is a school that has been developed by fuqaha, and what we call fiqh in Islam. It's the people who try, the scholarship that came with the Islamic law, with the Sharia, because you've got the legal axioms, and we've got later on the thinking on the objectives or the ends of each axiom, and that was needed mainly in the starting from the 9th century, when life became very complex for the Muslim society, with incorporating new comers, like the new civilizations, like the Persian civilization, the people from Greece and from the ancient, from Europe and from North Africa, from different cultures, Byzance. So, and these people had their traditions of scholarship, they had their tradition of philosophy and so on. So there a lot of questions came about, and mainly as Islam met other cultures, there was new interests and new fields of scholarship and among these the fiqh and the diversity of schools that saw light during the period, mainly starting from the 9th century and until now, if you want. And but at some period of history, it came down. Then it came again, and there are a lot of people now working to develop all this science of maqasid. If you have science of maqasid, which is the purposes of Islamic faith, and you've got a lot of people who's been, the Islamic law, the Islamic Sharia, and they've been working on the foundations of these of the Sharia, and the Sharia, the Islamic law, and finally, at least Al-Ghazali, since he died in 1111, so 1111, and this man was, I think, Mohsen will talk about his philosophy, so I'm not going to stay long on that. And this man laid the foundations for the science of maqasid, or the intentions of, and he said that all Islamic law, each single prescription, it had at least 5 intentions. 1, to save the religion, to save life, to save lineage or progeny, intellect, and property. Maybe I'll go back to that later on, but still when the Quran, for instance, said you should give up or stop or not to drink alcohol, this is it is meant to save the intellect. When it is forbidden to for mothers, they must save their babies or their pregnancy, and this is to save lineage or progeny. So each law itself, it has an intention, and if we start from these intentions, they are still working until today. And you see in the end, I have a quotation from the Malaysian Prime Minister, who stated that Malaysia can be an example for other Muslim nations on what it meant, what it means to be progressive and developed nation based on 5 objectives of Sharia: to uphold the faith, life, uphold the faith, life, intellect, progeny, and property. So, and he said that our government policies have been always based on these 5 principles of Maqasid. So the Maqasid, or the legalist view, hasn't lost its fervor even today. Okay, now there is a second school, which is the Falsafa view. And Falsafa, it came with philosophy, the Greek tradition of philosophy. At some time, Muslims had very enlightened leaders, maybe better than today, and they used to give to every translated book the equivalent of it in gold. Just imagine, Richard, if we receive the weight of our book in gold, we will work day and night. So, this means that there was a great interest in scholarship at some period of the Islamic history. And among the books that were translated, of course, Indian books of mathematics and Persian books, and also philosophy books from Greece. And mainly the philosophy of Plato, but he was confused. Yeah, they were confused, translated with Plotine. So, but still, they could recognize the big orientations of Platonism and also Aristotle, and mainly this in ethics, in the ethics and logic. His books on logic. So this movement had conceived happiness as the work of reason. In order to be happy, you have to use your reason. You have to think about the world. And we've got already in the Quran many verses that that motivate people to go and think and explore the nature and to learn from their environment and surroundings and so on. And this Falsafa view came to reinforce this attitude and to give somehow the methodology how to do it. But again, in short, philosophers, many of them at some period of time, they said that philosophy is dangerous. And because there was a lot of discussion, like between Al-Ghazali and Averroes, Ibn Rushd in the Muslim Maghreb, and Averroes was defending the philosophy, meanwhile Al-Ghazali was defending a more legalist view of Islam, the fiqh schools. And he was against, and for many people they said Al-Ghazali killed philosophy. And in his book, his book is called the philosophers, something, anyway, the errors of philosophers. And so these schools clashed, but for many people, they took somehow in the middle position. They said, okay, you can go for philosophy, but not for everybody. This is specific to illuminated and highly intelligent people, and this type of happiness should be reserved to these very intelligent and highly intelligent people. I've got many examples. Ibn Bajjah, and this one was in the Muslim West in Andalusia. I was in Spain now, and this man was a genius, Ibn Bajjah. But he was a businessman. He wrote a book. One of his main books, he didn't finish it because he was so involved in the wool business that he was, that the book was left in the middle. But still, it is very, very useful, Ibn Bajjah. And he lived until 1139. You have the date here. So Ibn Rushd, the same thing. He was maybe one of the people who, they say that he influenced many Western philosophers. So, and he was, illuminating, and he was talking about many routes to reach happiness, and one of them is the use of independent use of reason. So, conclusion: the use of the intellect and reason is the most important means towards happiness for Falsafa scholars in general. Now, the third view that it is discernible, recognizable within this lots, thousands of years of work. In fact, which I didn't read all, of course, but this Sufi movement is very, very important. They say it comes from the word Suf. And for some people, Suf, it is not only the equivalent of wearing inexpensive clothes, but it means also purity. It's white, and it can be cleaned very quickly. And here, this movement started very early. For Rabi al-Adawiyya, this is a female mystic, and who abandoned her life of pleasure and so on, and she devoted herself to God. We've got Al-Ghazali, as I said before, and this man, he was a teacher, and he started his life studying philosophy, but he was, like hit by depression, and he abandoned his teaching career and went away for 10 years, and that he was thinking of, he had this meaning crisis, and in the end, he said that the best way to reach happiness is to follow the Sufists. Again, Ibn Arabi, and this man is very interesting. He's very interesting in terms of, he holds that real knowledge cannot come from imitating others, from looking only and reading maybe about other models, but in exercising life. You have to exercise Sufism in order to reach happiness. And it's not just an existential quest thinking, but it is real work, which means sometimes, yes, thank you, it means sometimes to abandon some ordinary life and to go into practicing many stages in order to reach the highest stage of Sufism, which is to reach the halul, or intermixture with the highest being, or to live the intimate union with God. And this is stages, and there are a lot of books and thousands of books and thousands of Sufi methods now, which you can find, at least not thousands, but I could find 300 of them, which are until now, and some in the US, for instance, the Nation of Islam, and many movements which are influenced by Sufism and could be recognized within Sufism, and still they are very much different from each other. Okay, now the implication of this. Now, we've got the legalist view, and this legalist view, now it ended up, a minority of these people who followed this ended up becoming jihadists. Maybe Joe will talk about these type of people, because they think that quality of life or well-being, it is to impose the religion and to impose, in some cases, their view of life and quality of life and so on through jihad. This is very small, and this is the group that is making a lot of, how do we call it, a lot of noise all over the world, and sometimes the people in the West, they are identifying all Muslims with those people. These people are just, very minority, and they are not, their view is very extremist. Now, there are Salafists, or Wahhabis, different things. I leave these implications to you to read. Maybe Now for the Sufism, it continues to live, and you find different types of behaviors that could be referred to as Sufism, but still, in short, there is a need for a real intellectual renewal in the Islamic world, and which accepts all these views as being diverse views of quality of life, and they have, I think, to come together and discuss things and think very deeply about things, and that needs, of course, spreading higher education and discussing things, by intellectuals first, but also with regard to the whole society, with the aim for peaceful change. I leave these implications for you, and if there are any questions, I'm going to answer them. I'm sorry, maybe I did it very quickly and not well organized.
You'll have a chance. We're going to take questions at the end of the 4 presentations, because the 4 presentations are really integrated.
Okay.
Different dimensions of the same phenomenon. So we'll take them at the end and we'll be able to say more. Thank you very much. We have literally only 30 minutes left for the session, and I have to allocate 15 minutes of it to Joe, and I promised discussion to take place. What I'm struck by, and I'm not going to make a formal presentation because I've given you the handout, and I'm going to ask you to review the handout because it would be too much for me to begin to unpack that. What struck me very much was the fact that as we approach these various conceptions of well-being, this is not an ahistorical event, but one has to go through history and has to understand the transitions that have taken place over the long term. For example, everything you put on the side of Islam in the earlier period, before the separation of church and state and the collapse of the papal states and so on, could have been said about Christianity. Yeah. You could have reversed it and it would have been the same thing. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't know history. The materials that I've presented and that Habib and I have presented at great length in a very substantial book downstairs on the social progress of Islamic societies really deals with Islamic societies post the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1919. Just to give you an example that we have to go through history. So we began with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and came forward, and most of the data that we report are from 1945 and forward, particularly 1970 and forward, which is when most of the social indicator data were available. Just as a bottom line, the situation in Islamic societies varies enormously. We have a teeny tiny number of Islamic societies that are extremely wealthy and prosperous. And they are, of course, the oil exporting states and the financial centers of the Middle East and West Asia. But there are very few. They make up less than 5% of the total population of the Muslim world, which is 24% of the entire global population. Many of the people of the Muslim world live in desperate circumstances as a result of the decolonization process that took place. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed, most of the territories were assigned to European powers as colonies. And those countries have slowly emerged since the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 1980s as independent nation states, and have been able to build their own societies with their own values and their own perspectives and so on. But it's been a very slow and very gradual process, with the result that when you examine the social progress in Islamic societies versus even other developing nations of Africa, Asia, Latin America, the situation in Islamic societies is very, very difficult, with certain exceptions, and very important exceptions, which are important for us to study from a case analysis point of view. So let me just make that by way of comment. Joe will take us forward in time to the present and dealing with the tension that is currently being expressed between the East and the West, between Muslim, non-Muslim, between Islamic society, non-Islamic society, as expressed in the level of violence that's taking place in both sets of societies. Because it's not restricted only, obviously, to Western society, since most of the casualties and most of the incidents really occur within Islamic societies themselves. So let me turn to Joe, who will deal with the issue of terrorism. Then we will come back. Joe will talk for 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll have 10 or 12 minutes for questions, answers, conversation between ourselves. Okay?
As Richard mentioned, this is something, again, it takes us to the present, and we can talk about the controversy. Well, it is a very controversial topic. It seems like everybody's so involved in this topic, and every time we say something, again, emotions flare, and people have very strong opinions on what's happening. So I'm going to try and tone it down. Well, I'm going to try. So this work is essentially based on some previous work that Richard and I have done, and we published this one article in Social Indicators Research, which is called Travel in Islamic Militancy and Acts of Terrorism, Quality of Life Analysis. And did you change this?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
I wish I knew how to do it.
So this is the summary of the paper, and it, one of the things that I just want to point out is that we did a quality of life analysis dealing with a whole bunch of Islamic nations. And some of the indicators that we used, Civil Liberties Index, failed states index.
Your mic is not working well.
Yes, you may as well just
change it back to this. Okay, why don't you just turn it on? So again, we're looking at Civil Liberties Index, the Failed States Index, Global Terrorism Index. So these are essentially some of the measures that we used, the indicators, to try and correlate them with something that's Richard's Social Progress Index, which was called the Weighted Index of Social Products, which is the one which is at the very bottom of that slide. And it represents, it captures quality of life in all countries. And Richard has been doing a fantastic job, keeping track of the quality of life of globally, and you can really get into that index. But the next slide is the thing that I wanted to concentrate on, which is when you look at the correlations among these, this is what I want you to focus on. That when we're looking at terrorism, and when we're looking at quality of life, look at how sizable this negative correlation is. It's not only significant, but it is sizable. Now, what does that tell us? Tell us that in Islamic countries, those that experience a lower quality of life are likely to experience a high level of terrorism. That's what the correlation is saying. Now, again, we're not getting into the causation of this. And the causation of this is where we will try to make sense of that correlation. We're trying to make sense of that correlation. And this is, of course, where we get to talk about jihadist terrorism. Now, one of the things, of course, qualify this whole idea of jihadist is we have a very small minority of Muslims who chose to pursue their vision in a very violent way, and they're creating a great deal of chaos. And although some of that chaos is in Europe and the United States, most of the chaos is in Islamic countries. Most of the chaos is taking place in Islamic countries. So the theme of this presentation and ultimately the paper that we're writing is that we need to understand the psychopathology of this, the psychopathology. And we want to do this by trying to figure out exactly what the drivers are. So we want to build on what we've done, and this is what we think is happening. Much of the conservative Western, I guess maybe I call them militants too. Well, no, another word would be hawkish. A lot of hawkish Westerners think that what is happening is essentially a cancer in our midst, and what we need to do is we need to just cut it out. And the surgical way of doing it would be through military means. Well, let's go about carpet bomb the son of a blah blah, right? Or let's dismantle this military apparatus. And we know how to do this. In economic terms, essentially what they're doing is they're focusing on the supply side of what you might call the market of jihadists. Meaning they look at the sources of funding, they look at how jihadists are recruited and how they conduct their operations, and of course counterterrorism measures are formulated as a function of knowing how the jihadist organization is set up, and therefore the supply kind of economics perspective. Again, from an economics perspective, we're missing the other side of the equation, and the other side of the equation is the demand. And we need to ask ourselves, what is attracting the jihadists to the cause, and what are the causes? What is driving market demand for the jihadist cause, and that causes this kind of chaos? So we try to analyze this, and again, the model shows us that there are macro-environmental factors, economic, political, cultural, religious, globalization, media, and other past counter-terrorism actions that have historically, over time, has led to a negative sentiment of aggrieved Muslim, aggrieved. They have a grievance, right? And that grievance, that frustration, that resentment, that anger, and you yes, translate it into hate, is possibly causing increase of market demand of the jihadist cause and the terrorist organization taking up the cause. So let's try and further analyze those economic, political, cultural, religious, globalization, media factors, and what we're doing in terms of counter-terrorism actions that is feeding, right? That is feeding this negative sentiment and making things worse. Making things worse. This is the model that we came up with. And of course, we don't have time to get into the intricacies of this model, but let me just give you an example of some of the major dimensions. Let's look at the economic factors. In Islamic societies, and many of those, income disparities, poverty, and unemployment is very much associated with acts of terrorism. So there's plenty of evidence to suggest that, again, in societies, in countries that are besieged by income disparities and have a great deal of poverty and unemployment, that is a driver of terrorism. That is a driver of the jihadist militancy. Disparities in technological innovation, those countries that fall behind in terms of being able to deliver in terms of those products and services in an innovative way, again, may be another cause that political factors, authoritarian and tribal exclusionary regimes, and again, we can talk about, well, a whole bunch of examples out there, right? Religious factors, increased Islamic religiosity. It's just amazing. I was born in the Middle East. I was born and raised in Cairo and Beirut. When, I was born in 1952. And many years when I went back to the Middle East, I didn't recognize it. I didn't recognize the place that I grew up in. And it is extremely, much more Islamic than when I was growing up, when I was being there, when I was there growing up in my formative years. But it's not just based on my personal experience, but it's essentially, it's a documented fact. There is definitely increased Islamic religiosity, and definitely the whole idea of secularism is going down the tubes. And again, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that. Globalization and media factor. This particular factor indicates that that through globalization there is a sense of disparity between material wealth between the Islamic countries and other Western countries that is driving, that is essentially making, accentuating, maybe that's the right word, accentuating the feelings of aggrievement. And again, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that. Cultural factors, and again, Mohsen with his presentation, which is a very fine presentation, making the distinction between the East and the West, well, actually between the Western and Islamic societies. This whole business of decadence. I mean, Muslims and Muslim scholars, and again, that's very, very indicative in the presentation. They think of the Western conception of happiness is decadent because we're so much involved in hedonic well-being. Well, it's very unfortunate that Islamic scholars dismiss the concept of eudaimonia, and that is a very different. It's a very different conception of happiness. Philosophers have long documented that the good life is not about pleasure, but Muslim scholars have been fixated on thinking that the Western world is decadent because we're so pleasure oriented, and that's very unfortunate. And there's another thing, a cultural factor, which is Western prejudice and discrimination. There are a lot of Muslims that have been discriminated, in the West, whether it's the United States or just literally in all over Europe, and that's really accentuating this feeling of aggrievement among Muslims. But most important, if you look at that bottom box, what we are doing right now, we've been doing for the last 20-something years to combat counterterrorism is feeding terrorism, fueling terrorism. We're barking up the wrong tree. Muslims have been looking at us and saying, well, Muslims are being tortured. We send our intelligence operatives, and what they do is they torture the heck out of them, right? We have assassinations, and Muslims are looking at us and says, well, they're killing us. You know, was military strike, this whole business collateral damage, well, you know, we're going to just kill a few in order to save many. But do you realize that's a public relations disaster? Well, again, the hawkish people in our government, they don't realize this. How about any efforts to reintegrate former jihadists in civilian life? Are we doing any of that? Heck no. Again, accentuating the problem. So, in essence, what we're doing is we are barking up the wrong tree, and we're not addressing those factors that ultimately should address this idea of aggrievement among Muslims, this grievance, this frustration, resentment, anger, and hate, and ultimately that cause rise to the jihadist movement. What we need to do, yes, we need to, again, have a very different approach to counterterrorism, a very different approach, a quality of life approach. We need to get involved in nation building and address those quality of life factors, those drivers that ultimately play a role in the rise of the jihadist movement. Thank you.
Just evaporates. We're a very small group, so there's no need to field questions from me. Please identify yourself if you wish to make a comment or additional explication of some of the points, or raise a question. So please feel free to do it directly. We're just a very small group.
I have a comment. I'm Patsy Krager from Georgia Southern. A few years ago, I did a book review by Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart on Fixing Failed States. And they talked about, and his, I think it was a platform to run for president, but it was about rule of law reform as a panacea to the violence in Afghanistan. And it's been a failure because of the tribal factions, everything you have listed there. And it's just so interesting when you talk about the quality of life. So I hope somehow you can get your way into the White House and advise them, because I think, you know, we're all focused on, in America, all focused on this and the aggrievement. And just as you were talking, I mean, yesterday I was read in the New York Times about, you know, a woman wearing a burkini in France, and she was a fourth generation, and they made her take her clothes off and said, we're a Catholic nation, you know, and their motto is liberty, equality, except in the French model. So, you know, you think about all of this, you know, together, and it's all about the rule of law. And I'm also a lawyer, so I will admit that. And I believe in rule of law reform, but I don't think it can solve these problems. And so I think, you know, to your point, it's when we need to look at philosophy and other things. So I just have a comment. I think it's really interesting and fantastic. And I really know not much about Islam, and I just came because I thought I would learn a lot. And so it's exciting to hear all of this.
Please.
I have a question about Sharia and custom versus codification of certain concepts. I'm curious about how diversity within Islamic societies is managed and handled, particularly in the treatment of the so-called the kuffar, the kafir, the infidel, the non-believer. There is great diversity in many of these societies. There's religious diversity, minorities of various kinds. And how does that get reconciled in the broader quality of life conception and the collective when you are treating, how do you treat that? I guess is my question.
Is your question directed? I gather you're looking at Habib, so I assume, or Mohsen.
Well, from my understanding, Christianity has been before Islam. In these, at least there have been multi or many religions existed in Syria before Islam. And when Islam came, it was accepted by some Syrians, and some others were accepted as part of the community. There was some treaties, some laws. Maybe the laws, they were not in the benefit of Christians at some time because Muslims were the leaders. But in other times, in terms of economy and so on, they had all the opportunities like every citizen. So there was no problem living together. Now, when everything is troubled and when everything is mixed up, you've got different voices getting out. Islam and Christianity has never clashed in Syria. Maybe if you take the 1800 with the existence of the French colonizer, but before, that was my century.
And I don't mean Syria per se. My example in
Yeah,
mind
you
is more
give-
the Ottoman example, where by law, certain minorities that were considered by with different terminology, different, were imposed different taxes, 300% taxes on income, things like that, in the early part of the century, in the late 1800s, which, so it was the encapsulation in legal terms of a certain approach, which affected the quality of life of the collective.
Which
Obviously,
was
there was a
designed, if I'm
breakdown
understanding it, to really oppress
to
the
oppress.
minority community.
It led to the breakdown of the empire, essentially, on some level. It's interesting.
In times of conflict, if you look at things in like conflict, that's a specific situation that you cannot use it as a rule. But before, it depends on the sources you get. What I read, I know that Abdel Kader, the Algerian leader, he was one of the people who did a lot of negotiation between Christians and Muslims in Syria. And the problems that they had was minor for each community suffering, but still, it is a time of conflict, so we cannot measure on that.
I think it's also important to note that during the life of the prophet himself, there was great heterogeneity in terms of representation. Christians, Jews, Muslims, there was no difference between them as far as the prophet was concerned. That only came later on with the Crusades and with the conflict back and forth and retaliation and revenge and so on. So it's very important to look at that. But no, every society has structured itself in such a way to oppress or control, I guess more deliberately, control particular minority groups that were out of fashion during the period of time. Certainly that's the history of the American society.
So I'm not sure what this means for our future, but what struck me about your presentation, son, is 50, 60 years ago, you could have substituted Islam for Catholicism easily.
Would have been the same.
And so what have been some of the driving forces that have converted some of those rigid practices to a more diverse and open society? I mean, as a kid growing up in Philadelphia, I was expected to hang out with Catholics. I had, the neighbor was non-Catholic, and we were told not to. So 60, 65 years ago, that was the landscape of the playing field. I was also told to marry a nice Irish Catholic girl, which I didn't do. And my father was very upset. And so in fact, he told me, when I told him I was getting married, he said, have you given her a diamond? I said, no. And that was his way of saying to me that he did not approve of me marrying a Latin woman. I'm not sure what this means other than there's hope. Hope springs eternal.
Unfortunately, I just have to say, it's after 3 o'clock now, which is quite a problem. But make your final comment, and I think that somebody knows.
It would be a good idea to have a conversation with someone about that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Please, there's one, you had the last one.
So I need and I have to say about the second thing. I think he kind of presented a view that there's such a large gap between the Western conception of happiness and Islamic conception. Because I feel that, especially in Malaysia, as we learn more about religion, that is not so separate. For example, if you're saying that Islam, Muslims value suffering, there is some, if you talk to maybe social psychologists, I don't know if there are any research, it's not about valuing suffering, but it's about a reminder to be grateful, or some let's say grounding. So we remind ourselves as to what is important to us. So it's not so much that we value suffering, but when we suffer, we try to remind ourselves what do we have to be grateful about. That there is someone, and in this case God, who still loves us, and things like that. And this is not so separate from positive psychology. And yeah. So I feel that there maybe is not such a big gap, but perhaps if you don't go too deep into it, then maybe there may appear to be such a big gap. But I think as we learn more, the gap is not so large, because we learn that, for example, as in not going too much to hedonism, that really is something just like escapism, which kind of makes us feel good for a while, but then we go back and go back to our normal state, so to speak. That's kind of how I feel about it.
And the importance of eudaimonia too being lost. I think, Joe, you made a really great point in there, that it's not just about happiness. Eudaimonia is the other half of it together.
I'm afraid because of time, we have to stop, but we can certainly talk informally. Thank you all for coming.
We can have later by the site. Maybe by the site.
Is it a private project?